Welcome back to the Papers Podcast, where the number needed to listen is 1. Actually, the number needed to watch is 1 as well. Today, we are continuing our little pilot with video casting. We hope to have a YouTube channel up sooner than later. We are all on our best behavior, as best as that can be, fully caffeinated. There's 2 of me in an attempt to see how that actually works. That will still make me only 50% as smart as Lara, Linda, and 5 times smarter than Jason.
It's true. I'll endorse that.
Jason, how are you today?
I'm doing okay.
You're recording live in the Batcave, is from what I can determine there. Is that right?
This isn't the Batcave. This is the headquarters. This is the central brain.
All right. Linda, how are you today?
I am just fine. Went for a bike ride around the whole island of Montreal yesterday. Lovely day, great ride.
I can't imagine doing anything better on a Sunday. Montreal in a spring, warm, nice day, maybe a stop for a coffee somewhere. That'd be pretty amazing. Lava, you are ready to rock and roll. You have a great paper for us today. Why don't we just jump in?
Sounds good. Friends, I have picked a paper for us today. I'm excited to talk to you about it. And wait for it. It's not from a journal. Insert gasp here, right? Like I'm breaking our rules. I decided it was time, frankly, I decided it was time for me to figure out what preprints are. So I dug into that. So I'm going to share a little summary, some of what I found with you. And I found a paper that's in preprint that's really good. And the topic gives me a chance to put together some additional resources for our listeners so that the abstract that you'll find at the Papers Podcast, our website, is going to have some extra goodies for you. So that's 3 good reasons for this manuscript. So let's dive in. So reason number 1 is, what is a preprint? So I've been working in medical education and health professions education for a long time. And if you've been in this field, say for the past, 4 years, you've heard us talk about preprints. This has been coming increasingly part of our dissemination platforms, the ecosystem. And so what is that? A preprint is a version, that's important, of a scholarly or academic manuscript that you share on an online platform. And it's called a preprint service. And it's posted there before peer review and formal publication. So you put it in the preprint server before you submit it to the journal. And it's not peer reviewed. It's really literally just a server. You can think of it like a repository, an archive, and sometimes data, just for the record. But it lives there, and it has very minimal screening. They might look to make sure it's not rude or there's not inappropriate content, but otherwise it just survives in this server. And I heard about preprints, honestly, the first time from my husband, because these are really common in the fields of physics and mathematics and those sorts of things. A little less so in our fields, but I think they're picking up. And why would they be picking up? A couple of really good reasons. If you're worried about getting scooped, this gets your name beside your findings publicly fast. Not sure that's really a concern in HPE, but if you are, then there it is. In theory, another reason is that you can get feedback from peers on preprints. I'll be honest, I checked out on some preprints that are available at HPE. I didn't see any comments, but the possibility is there. So again, something to think about. Some grants, another good reason, some grants want you to show early productivity. They want you to demonstrate that you're doing things and working on publications. And this is another way of making sure that you demonstrate that quickly and early. One last good reason, there is actually a very small but growing body of literature that says if your paper starts as a preprint, you get more citations once it's actually in print. So there are downsides to consider too. We can get into that. But before we do, why don't I toss the ball over to you guys? Jason, Linda, John, what do you think?
So I'm curious how many of us have done preprints or how many preprints you've done. Because I think I've done 4. They're all with Lauren Maggio, who's a huge booster of preprints. I think they're a fantastic idea. Why don't I do this with every paper? I don't know. I think it's it's habit. And people like Lauren and others are trying to help us break that habit. There's one thing you didn't list as part of your pros for preprints, and that is that they're open access. And if journals are slow and if journals peer review is painful, you can still get it out there. I think one of the papers that got the most attention was something that we did with Lauren and Tony Artino and the crew, and we tweeted about it, and then tons of people contacted us, and that made a big difference.
Linda, what are you thinking?
I've got a couple of questions. First of all, I've not done any preprints. Second, how do you respond when the journal says, has this been published elsewhere? So does a preprint count as a publication? I see people shaking their heads no. And third, my suspicion is that there could be quite a difference between what goes out in preprint and what may eventually be published after a series of reviews and revisions in a journal. And how far away, and I guess that last question is, where do you list this on your CV and how? So sorry, I didn't answer the question. I just asked a bunch more.
That's fine. I think John can probably answer most of those, so I'll let him go for it first.
I have done some preprints. You don't list them in your CV. They're not a peer-reviewed phenomenon, and it doesn't end at the preprint. You get it out. There's zero barrier to doing a preprint. There's no cost. You upload it, and it's usually there within minutes once you've uploaded, and accessible with a unique URL. But it's like the penultimate step as you submit for actual peer review and consideration and publication in a journal. My experience is that I've gotten zero feedback on those papers, which might reflect the quality of the papers or the quality of me. That was rhetorical. We don't all need to jump in with
I was agreeing,
answer.
John. Sorry.
Okay. But I think the HPE community is not culturally adept to preprints in the way that physics, engineering, computer science might be, where the debate happens long before the final version and people have an opportunity to jump in, and where the speed of information exchange is much different. What we did it for is we wanted to get that material out, organized, so that we could start using it for some of the courses that we wanted to build it off. And so that was helpful to actually have something to point people to say, this is the work that we're referencing and citing, and here is it packaged in a way that's easily accessible. There's one little downside, because the barrier to doing it is less, is that it just adds one more bit for predatory journals to scrape about you. And as soon as you put a preprint in, I used BioRex. As soon as I did that, my junk mail folder was immediately spammed endlessly by all these predatory journals, promising me to have it published in days if I would only send them some kind of cryptocurrency to their account somewhere in the southern secret layer of where all the criminals live. I don't know. So there's a minor little challenge that preprints present.
So I'm going to disagree with y'all just a little bit, because I do think you can list these on your CV. Remember, preprints are issued a DOI, but then you don't list it as a peer-reviewed manuscript. You list it as a preprint. I have never published a preprint, but I have published a post-publication review, right? So medical, I'm going to forget what it's called. Y'all remember what it's called?
MedEd Publish?
MedEd Publish, thank you. MedEd Publish is a post-review archive. So I've put things there. Again, never got anything. Yes, John?
If people aren't familiar with the journal Curious, Cureus, that's a journal that tries to merge typical indexed, peer-reviewed processes with this preprint model. You post your paper up, and then you try to solicit reviewers to comment,
drive traffic
on the same site, and then the review and your response to review and the final version all get packaged and bundled together, with the idea that the turnaround time for publication, the transparency, and all of the dialogue is happening in a much more open, crowdsourced kind of way. So it's a different kind of model. It's kind of the hybrid of the two.
Yeah.
And so Curious, I'd never heard of it, so I just Googled it, and it says something about a publication deemed controversial or predatory. Odd.
Well, I don't think the necessary curious is necessarily predatory. I don't think that's necessarily a good description that I would attach to it. But like all things that exist only online and that aren't peer reviewed, right? There's structures around peer review that are intentionally designed to make sure that the process is vetted, vigorous, academic. So when you go outside that space, there's a little more chaos, but we just have to be thoughtful.
That was put up by the publishing industrial complex.
There you go. So one last thing that I want to make sure you're aware, because Linda, you raised a point that's true. Some journals won't accept an article that's been preprinted. Now, it's the minority that do that. But Nature is a magazine that says if you've preprinted, you don't get to be in our you won't be considered for publication. So If you make this decision, there goes your shot at Nature. Pause for a moment. Small tangent. Are you all aware that medical education and like awesome scholar has been published in Nature very recently? Did you know this?
If it's you, this is just
No, this is a Varpio life goal. Like I have a life goal of getting into like nature or science or something like that. But we have to have a pause here to give a major kudos to Lara Nimmin, who is a published scholar in Science magazine. Science is a life goal for me. So like it's Nature, it's JAM, it's a big one. And Lara, we are so excited that you cracked a glass wall that was separating the health professions education community from one of the biggest top tier journals in the world. So Lara, from all of us to you, thank you for being the woman who brought the hammer and got us in there. The authors conducted a qualitative study from a constructivist orientation, bonus mark for telling me, using focus groups to find that participants, they wanted to speak with authors and editors. So for authors, they searched PubMed for journals published in 2022 in the medical education journals list. There will be a link to that article of that journalist in the notes for this podcast. And they used a random number generator. Love that. To select 50 articles from the list, and the first authors were contacted. They continued until they reached sufficient information power for their research goals. And for editors, they approached the editors-in-chiefs and deputy editors of 24 of the journals right on that list. And they held 5 focus groups using video conferencing, analyzing the transcripts of those focus groups using codebook thematic analysis. We can talk about codebook thematic analysis if you want, but first I'm going to open it up to my friends. Let's go, Linda, Jason, John.
I think it was actually really clear what they did. And, 50 authors probably gives you enough people if some say no. So you've got decent numbers for focus groups. And I am not quite sure, although they did explain it, what the difference is between in terms of this kind of coding.
Well, Linda, lucky us. I do have a small thing put aside to tell you about it. But what I'll do first is I'll let Jason then John make comments in case they're feeling brave and want to offer a description themselves. Never know.
I thought the methods were good. One thing that wasn't clear for me, and maybe you noticed this in some fine print that I missed, were the focus groups mixed between editors and authors, or were they separate? I just didn't notice that in the paper.
Well, you just didn't read it enough. I mean, it was fairly clearly put, and the reasons why were clearly put.
I'm sorry, I missed it. I'm setting this up, Linda. Come on, help me here. Jesus.
John, why don't you jump in?
Ooh,
make it a chaos sandwich.
Everybody needs some coffee or not coffee. I'm not sure what it is, but the vibe is a little chaotic. Here are some thoughts about the methods from my point of view. Wow, they had to do a double REB application, presumably because they actually had their interviews at different institutions, which is a whole extra layer of work. So congrats for that. It was kind of weird, and I'm going to quote Varpio, and I'm fine with that because the world is only seen through her eyes. But they did this weird thing of randomization for constructivist type of approach, which suggests that they weren't being intentional about who they got, but then they were very intentional because they made sure that they had editors to juxtapose the opinion of editors versus authors. They did say the first author was their choice rather than the senior author, and I wish they'd have maybe done a mix of senior authors. Oftentimes, a senior author will drive, we're going to go to this journal or not. In fact, 15% of their sample, as we'll find out in a second, were either PhD candidates or a librarian. And I'm not sure why they lumped that together, but I'm just quoting the number that they said. So the first author might not have been wielding as much direction as to where they're going to publish. The last part, I think, was interesting, was just this idea of codebook thematic analysis. And I know that you're going to say a little thing about that, Lava. I would love for you to contrast why do this extra work? Why not have the prior publication be the lens that informs their subsequent analysis rather than being the place where they start with their code and then expand beyond it, because it seems like an extra layer of work that might require more flexibility as they move forward. So that's the why do that? Why not just start with standard generic thematic analysis? So I want to hear the answer to that, because it does feel like extra work.
Okay. So I have so many things to say in response to your comments, John. In fact, I have a t-shirt today that...
I knew you were going to have a t-shirt.
Oh, yeah.
Every time you're zipped up, I know there's a secret thing coming, and I jump into that trap. Like, it's
every
like...
time!
You're like the Roadrunner, and I'm Wile E. Coyote, and there's an anvil that looks like a t-shirt that gets me every time.
So my t-shirt says, I would agree with you, but then we would both be wrong. So first of all, let's talk about why the kind of sampling they did was just fine. They did do purposive sampling. They didn't interview or use as their participants everybody everywhere, anybody who published. They were purposive in terms of speaking to authors and editors. That was their goal, right? Those were they thought about, they have reasons for deciding on these two groups. Now you can then, nitpick, decide, whatever, in terms of who within those groups are the people they wanted to talk to. But they had decided to speak to authors and editors because they had a stake and they had important things to say about this topic. The second thing then is that, but now you have this list of like a lot of authors, for instance. Think about all the first authors in a year across 24 journals. There's no way you're going to have a nuanced sampling procedure necessarily to distinguish between all of these people who already fit within a broad category of these are the right kinds of people I want to talk to. So they used a random number generator. I have nothing wrong. There's nothing for me that's wrong with that. I got no problem. In terms of the focus group question, Jason, so they held 5 focus groups. Now, they did do one at first to see if they initially I'm reading from the manuscript. We initially separated authors and editors into different groups to determine whether a difference in discussion existed. However, we did not observe a difference and conducted the remaining focus groups with a combination of participants. So that's that. Now, last, about bringing in theory when they want. So let's talk about thematic analysis and codebook analysis and get into this. So thematic analysis is an umbrella term under which there are different varieties. Right? So there's many varieties of thematic analysis. We often talk about reflexive thematic analysis from Brown and Clark because when you do qualitative research in health professions education, you often use a constructivist or interpretivist orientation. And a reflexive thematic analysis is in line with that paradigmatic orientation. That's fine. This study used a different approach and is called codebook thematic analysis. Now, the codebook approach has the researcher using a structured codebook, and then it often has themes therefore that are predefined before coding, just like the authors did. They use previous research about this topic to structure and build their codebook. They also remained open to new themes that would be developed, that they would identify and construct through the focus groups. So codebook is not top-down deductive work at the exclusion of inductive. What it does do, though, is it says, hey, there's pre-existing literature. That should shape the way we do analysis. Let's start with that and then see if there are differences or other things that also need to be addressed. Any follow-up questions?
I am not familiar with it because I haven't done it. I did do some reading about it, and it seems to work well. But if you are taking that deductive approach, rather than saying, hey, let's just use the previous research as a sensitizing framework for our analysis, I'm not sure why you do the double work, because not only do you do deductive, but you have to do inductive up, because as new stuff comes along, it seems like you're making it a more challenging analytic process for you. I'm agnostic to using it. Or I shouldn't even say I'm agnostic. I haven't used it, but I think it's a fine approach. It just seems like an extra layer of, forehead wrinkling.
Could I just interject there to say, you talked about, use the term sensitizing framework. So what's the difference between a code book analysis and sensitizing framework?
Okay, so that is a whole other kettle of fish. And what I will do is I will promise to do a methods consult about this. Obviously, it's a topic that we need to discuss. So I can do a whole methods consult on it. But if I go into that right now, we're going to spend a whole 20 minutes on it. So Linda, thank you for pointing out the need. We'll come to that, but I'll have to do that in a separate episode. And you know what? While we're at it, maybe I could do something about information power too, because I know that might be a concern as well. So, but with that, let's move. No, Jason, you're not letting me move on.
Do I have any other follow-up comments? I just want to follow up. So my setup around the editors and the room is that I think there is a potential for a power differential. Would that...
Well, they just said they tried it and it wasn't
I know
an issue.
what they said. I'm just saying that I don't think I would do that if I was the author, if I did this study, because I worry that people would hold back if the author's in the room. If they can't say that this editor's journal sucks or this editor's journal has whatever fault and it influences my decision making. I wonder why they did that.
Well, I will we'll leave that comment there, Jason. That's your opinion. That's fine. It is what it is. Then in research, we may all make the decisions we make. We can put a reference to this point in the transcript, a little asterisk to reference the Varpio t-shirt. Now, moving on. I'm just teasing. Okay. The authors present 6 factors influencing authors' decisions. Now, just for the noteworthy, most of these are from the previous research, which makes sense because they use that as the front end, right, for their deductive work, for their code book construction. So 6 topics. Number 1, participants strongly considered the journal's impact, and that impact was described in terms of the journal's impact factor and the readership of the journal. And that's probably not so surprising. Number 2 was fit. Did the paper align with the journal's scope, its focus? Here, participants talked about looking to see what would be attractive to the journal. Here again, readership factored in. That makes sense. Number 3 was journal level technical factors like time to publication, rigid word limits, where the journal was indexed. I have a real problem with word limits because I tend to see it like I see the speed limit, more of a suggestion than a law. So I totally get the challenge there. That's something that factors into my thinking too. Number 4, peer review. Authors wanted to know that real experts who were positioned to give good feedback were going to be reviewing their papers, and that factored into their decisions.
How would they know?
Next.
Sorry.
I think you can tell from the quality of resources of comment you get back, right?
Yeah, but so maybe for next time then. If you're I'm thinking about early authors.
If you're an early author, you may not have that insight. Yeah. You're absolutely right. But if you're a senior, you probably have some experiences in terms of who's reviewed your papers at different journals. Number 5 factor, open access. It wasn't a major factor, but it was a complementary one. Open access was largely described as a benefit, but open access fees are real and they can be big. So money does factor into that one. And last but not least, a new theme, and that is called social relationships. Participants, especially the senior ones, senior authors and editors, talked about knowing the editors, right? Like on a first name basis. They talked about editors of journals using their first name, and that influenced where they submitted journals. It also made it harder, though, for junior scholars to break into the journal because they didn't know. So those are some interesting factors. I'm really interested in knowing what you all think. Let's talk to John, then Jason, then Linda.
I want to comment on 3 of their themes, which stuck out for me. The first was the journal impact factor. I guess I would modify it a bit in my own thinking. When I think about where to put a manuscript, I don't really know the difference between the first tier, as I think about the medical education or health professions education journals, and what differentiates one impact factor to the other, versus the kind of the second tier. And I don't want to name those because I respect all of the journals and they all do different things. And presumably because they went through this MEJ list, there is quite a number of them. But the impact factor, when you compare maybe the top the top performing journal in terms of impact factor, is a non sequitur when you compare it to all of the big clinical journals that my peers in my own department are using. So New England, we talked about Science at the beginning, Nature, it's a non-starter. And so I don't care about the impact factor so much, but I guess I would modify it saying there are maybe a top tier, which I think really goes to the second point of who is going to read it and what's going to be the scope of exposure. The second part I thought was a little interesting. People said they really wanted good feedback. I try to get good feedback on my journals before I send it anywhere. And I'm usually debating the feedback that comes back to me as it's expert or not. In fact, I'm debating it so much that with Teresa Chan and Sandra Montero, we've produced a board game called Dear Reviewer 2, and it's going to come this holiday season. I guess I'm using this as an infomercial, as an experience with the quality of feedback that we receive.
I love it.
Oh, you got competitors out there, John. There's a Publish or Perish game.
Yeah, well, this is basically Cards Against Humanity, but written from the point of health professions education nerds. So I will gift all of you a game if you promise to promo it in your own local journal clubs. So I don't actually believe it's that constructivist. I got to say, that's a weird set of focus group participants that said, we really enjoyed the feedback. The last part is when I was like, holy smokes, this paper, I know why you chose this preprint. Because that last factor around social relationships blew my socks off. Like, I was really astounded. First off, I'm not sure if this is best practice, but they first name drop some of the preeminent editors in their manuscript. And I think that's bad practice because they haven't consented to that. We certainly talk about de-identification if we can, but ideally anonymization of our data. And here's an example where they went the actual other way and said, here's the first names. And it takes nobody with any facility with Google to figure out who we're talking about. Second, it gives the illusion that there is this secret cabal network of you can get your paper published there. And I bet you the journal EICs will be hopping mad if that's the impression that the larger HPE community takes from it. I don't think that's the case. That has never been my experience. And never have I ever picked up the phone and say, hey, so-and-so, I got a manuscript. What do you think? Will you take it? Because they shouldn't take my call. It should rest on the quality of the science. It should go to the decision editor who should desk reject it or send it out for review. And it should be done ideally in an anonymized fashion, but I know that the DE is not going to be anonymized. They're going to see who that is because they're going to see the submission. But we got to have a separation of church and state. And I really am, it's a problem for me if this is the actual phenomenon. And I don't think it is. I think in the focus group, something happened there and it got interpreted or coded in a different way. I can't believe that's the current state.
Yeah, I'd like to. So, John, I just want to respond to the latter bit of what you said. I have never contacted an editor to say, will you publish? But I have contacted an editor to say, is this the type of paper, this topic, this scope suitable for your journal? There's a difference there. And usually they say, send it in and we'll have a look at it. On one or two occasions, they've said, that's a little bit off scope for us and try somewhere else. And that has been helpful.
Okay. First of all, this absolutely happens. And maybe it's because John and I are white guys that maybe we don't see it as clearly or something like that. But this absolutely happens. It happens in clinical journals. It must happen in education journals. And if I'm being honest, there are things that I've been invited to write or theme issues that I've done because of my network. And I think that's true. So I think this is a real phenomenon. I think we should be honest about it. The paper's findings were not earth-shattering, though this is an important theme. I was surprised that they emphasized open access so much. I know that's a passion of some of the writers of this paper, because I didn't think that the results supported such an emphasis. When I read this, it made me reflect. So it's this really good paper to choose for this conversation. Made me reflect on the people that I work with on papers, which are mostly people who are more early career than me. And I have a sense of this. I work in a hospital where journal impact factor is important. It determines some scholarship points that help you get protected time to write the next paper. And there's no question that that especially early career people want to aim for higher JF. So that's a real thing. And I know, John, like they're exponentially different between the Lancet and academic medicine. But some of our departments at our hospital, they just make an index so that the Lancet equals academic medicine. That's real dollars. So I think JAF is a real thing. I think it's more important for early career researchers. I also think if you're an early career researcher, you just want anybody to take your journal. Like, please take my paper. I think that the further we get along in our career, there is an evolution towards audience and impact. I want people to be influenced by this work. I want people to comment. I want people to engage. That might change where you publish because you know where that audience reads. I think there's an evolution by career stage, and that's not possible to suss out in this paper. but cool paper, made me think.
I just want to add there before we move on that one of my takeaways was that there's a link between 4 and 6. In other words, between social relationships and quality of peer review. Somebody said earlier on, how do we know what the quality is? And it's those people with those social relationships, the senior authors who have an idea of that. And that means that, despite what John said earlier about first authors perhaps being the more junior people on the team, they must have had some senior authors in the focus groups.
So, I was all flippant with you, Jason, when you talked about power differentials between editors and authors. But our conversation's making me think that perhaps I ought not to have been, that there's, especially between, and maybe even thinking about it in terms of more junior first authors and more senior first authors, less so than the editors, because there are different perceptions and understandings. Because, for instance, I could imagine in conversation, I would reference editors-in-chief by first name, but I would never reference them by first name in the sense that I can reach out to this person and get my paper published, but more in terms of that name represents, in my mind, as like a placeholder for that journal's direction right now, because different editors take different directions for journals. And I think the other point that y'all raised that I think is really important is that, but no, Jason, you mentioned this, and I'm just going to reflect. I have been commissioned to write. Somebody has reached out to me and say they're doing a special topic or like this, and they've commissioned me to write. But I've never worked on a study, then written the paper, and then reached out to an EIC and said, I need you to publish this for me. That's just, I've never seen that happen. That's never, and I've published a bit. So I'm just interesting that's your experiences and mine are so different on that.
I don't think that's what I'm suggesting. I don't think any of us, I have seen it in clinical journals where their editors and senior authors would talk. But in medical education, I think we're a little bit more polite than that. But I do think it subtly happens. I think that there is that, as Linda said, that interest, like, would you be interested in this topic? And that leads to a further dialogue, and maybe that expedites the review with the decision editor. I'm just saying, I think this phenomenon's real in our field.
Yeah. So, friends, with that, I'm just going to get really quickly to my third reason for picking this paper, because this paper talks about the experiences of authors who've been accepted and where they submitted, and it talks about the perspectives of editors-in-chief, but there's the other side of the coin, right? There's so many authors who are trying to get in to these journals, to get into the conversation. So part of the reason I wanted to select this manuscript is because of all the attachments you're going to find at paperspodcast.com that are resources that I've curated over the years from different editorial groups, different leaders in the community, of advice of what it is that editors are looking for, things that you as an author can be keeping in mind when you're sitting there trying to write a problem gap hook. And if you don't know what a problem gap hook is, don't worry. There's a link to Lorelei Lingard's and Chris Watling's an author in that group, in that set of papers too, The Writer's Craft, which is part of Perspectives on Medical Education's journals, columns. And there's a link to all of those. So if you don't know, if we say problem gap hook and you don't know what that is, don't worry. There's a link in there to help you figure it out. So those were the three reasons I really wanted to make sure we had this paper today. I hope it helped all of you become a little more savvy in preprints, in considerations to think about when you're selecting your journal, and it also gave you some additional resources. So we're now going to move on to the dubious section of our podcast, where we randomly allocate numbers to categories that really aren't real. So let's start with methods, and we'll go Jason, Linda, John.
So that's I love this section, Laura. Thank you for setting it up. This is a 4. I'm taking a point away for having editors in the room. I think that's a bigger deal than people on this podcast have let on. And I think people in the audience will agree with me. So please write it.
I agree. It's a 4, same reason. And I think let me start that again. I agree. It's a 4. And I'd like to go back to something John said earlier about picking first authors that could have been more junior and not had much influence on the where the paper was submitted. You know, what they could have done was contacted the first author and said, who had the most influence, and then put those people in the focus group. So a 4.
You've heard all of my minor concerns with the methods. It's a 4. Jason, just a reminder, I think the EICs were a separate focus group. They weren't intermingled with the authors. So it was a different dynamic than you might be alluding to. I just want to make sure that we don't sync this preprint unnecessarily.
I think this is why I brought this up. There was 2 different answers to that question.
Okay, so this is this paper methodologically, I would give it a random number generator of 4, but because they also gave me their paradigmatic orientation bonus mark, congratulations, y'all, it's a 5. Now, moving on to educational impact, we can all just say 5 real fast because we've had such a great conversation about it, but I'll let you have your own opinion. Why don't we go backwards? It's now a memory game. Who gets to remember where they went?
That's not that hard. As I'm going to give this a 4. I want to do something, though, that is really going to irritate you, Lava. I'm going to call this a replication study for constructivist, for constructivist methodology. If they want to do code book analysis, I'm just picking on you a little bit.
Yeah, I know.
But it's interesting that they find similar findings from that's been published previously. But it is, I almost want to give it a 5 because it makes me so hot.
Then do.
About this whole...
Yeah, it's 5.
No,
Moving on.
about the social relationship stuff. That's really interesting. I'm shocked. I can't quite believe it to be the case, which probably means that there's something there, and other people need to kind of dig in this group might want to approach this whole theme that they've unearthed with some future research, and I really hope they do.
So I'm going to give this a 4 plus, and it gets a 4 for similar reasons to John, but it gets the plus because of one quote that I saw in the paper. Can
I just interrupt? This is what you've done, Lara. You've wrecked our whole scale because everyone has a plus and there's a non-thing, and it's all like there's no reliability around this scale. It's
there never was either. There never was.
Okay, just need to get that off my chest.
Okay, now it's off your chest. I'm going to read my favorite quote, which says, this particular journal has a 1,500 word cap, and I don't know what you can say in 1,500 words that doesn't come across like a haiku.
Love that.
It's a fabulous quote. I could hardly wait to use it. 4.5.
I would similarly say an absolute integer of 4. I will bring this article to our journal club team and see if we can get a journal club theme around this. Does it change anything? I don't think the findings were particularly spectacular, but as John said, it's a springboard to a more thorough conversation. By the way,
so I'm going to give...
Sorry, just one last thing. That noise in the background was my dog growling in his sleep, just so you know.
Oh, isn't
it wasn't
that
my
cute?
stomach.
What's your dog's name, Jason?
Pippin.
So I'm going to give this paper a 5 and a bonus mark for Pippin and 1 for my dog, Keisha. So now it's a 7. And I'm going to give it that because, no, honestly, the conversation we've had today and all of the opportunities that we've been able to leverage this particular manuscript to talk about so many important topics, that totally makes it a 7 out of 5. And so, dear listeners, thank you so much for letting us into your ears. The space between your ears is the most precious space there is. So thank you so much for letting us invade. It totally is. If I'm in their brain, I have to thank them for letting me in. We hope that we provided you with a little levity. We hope we provided you with some insights. And if nothing else, we hope we inspired you to also find a sassy t-shirt that you too can wear and show your friends to make sure they have a smile every day. And so with that, remember, if you want to reach out to us, we're always happy to hear from you. And we will always read all the emails and comments. You can reach us on the internet at paperspodcast.com, or you can email us at thepaperspodcast@gmail.com. And with that, I'll say, talk to you later.
Bye-bye.
I'm going to change my tagline. Please save me from these 3.
Take care, everybody. By the way, this is a special episode. Not only do we film it, you can see John's tattoos on this podcast. And that's a rarity. Like, John's not always out there flashing his tattoos. So there you go. Maybe we should have a trivia question. Where is John's tattoo and what is it?
No, the real trivia question is, where's mine?
Okay, well, at that note, well, I just end right
Spicy
there.
podcast.
Gee, my God. Wow.
OMG.
You've been listening to the Papers Podcast. We hope we made you just slightly smarter. The podcast is a production of the Unit for Teaching and Learning at the Karolinska Institutet. The executive producer today was my friend Teresa Sörö. The technical producer today was Samuel Lundberg. You can learn more about the Papers Podcast and contact us at www.thepaperspodcast.com. Thank you for listening, everybody, and thank you for all you do. Take care.